All right, Morgan, this video is for you, but I'm also putting it on YouTube on my channel in case anyone else benefits from this. So basically, this is the information that any homeowner who owns a small engine needs to know about. So if you have a lawnmower, a snow blower, generator, pressure washer, chainsaw, weed whacker, leaf blower, or anything like that at all, you need to know this information if you want to keep yourself from having trouble. So the first thing you need to understand is gasoline is like fruits and vegetables. It goes bad, it goes rotten, it goes stale, whatever you want to remember, it goes bad. And that is sort of not obvious to a lot of people because you're buying gasoline all the time, but you're putting it in your car and you're using it up within a week. And modern day gasoline goes stale in worst case scenario 6 weeks, best case scenario a couple months. And basically what happens is gasoline comes from crude oil in the ground, and they divide it into factions. And what happens is the lighter factions evaporate away, leaving behind the heavier factions. And those heavier factions missing the lighter factions turn into like sludge or a little bit more greasy or thicker, and that can cause trouble inside the engine, inside the carburetor. And if it happens for long enough, for like a year, then what's left over really isn't even flammable. And so the first thing that happens is things get plugged up in the carburetor. The second thing that happens is the fuel itself just won't really even ignite. Now, a large quantity of fuel or a large volume of fuel goes stale less quickly than a small quantity or small volume. And so the fuel in your car won't go bad as fast as the fuel in your lawnmower. And so one of the common things people do is they empty out their gas tank in the fall when they're not going to use their lawnmower anymore. But that really just means that the fuel inside the carburetor is going to go bad even quicker. And so it's important to understand that on a machine, you have a fuel tank and a fuel line and a carburetor. And so even if you empty your fuel tank, you still have a little bit of fuel in the carburetor, and that will go bad by the time winter passes and you go to use your lawnmower again. So in the last 3 years, I've probably fixed around 500 small engines. And a very common issue is in the spring, when you go to use your lawnmower for the first time or your weed whacker for the first time, it doesn't start. And that's because the fuel has gone bad. And if it's gone bad enough that it's clogged up the jets in the carburetor, then you're out of luck. So it's very common for generators, pressure washers, and other seasonal equipment like tillers or snow blowers to not work when you need them. And so I'm going to show you today what you need to know so that you don't have that problem. So there are 3 techniques that I would suggest for resolving this problem, but I would say that this is the solution for 95% of you. This is a product called Fuel Stabilizer under the brand name Stable. And if this is a additive that you add to fuel, so when you go and you get your last couple gallons of fuel for the season, like let's say September, October, and you know the mowing season is about to be at an end or something like that, you want to go and start adding this to your fuel. And they say that this will keep the fuel fresh for 2 years, which in my experience has been the case. But you probably only need it to keep the fuel fresh for 6 months. And the way this works is basically you will, haven't opened this one yet. You'll basically squeeze on the bottle until this section gets filled up to the right increment. There are increment markings for how much you're going to be adding to the fuel. So like you would add a certain amount of this to a gallon, and those instructions are listed here. And then now this fuel that you've added it to, let's say this is a 1 gallon tank and you add the right amount for 1 gallon, your fuel will now not go stale for 24 months. And so as the end of the season is coming up, you can start adding stabilizer to your fuel, the fuel that will sit in the lawnmower all winter long or sit in the leaf blower all winter long. And then you won't have a problem in the spring. Now, you don't necessarily have to use this all summer long because you're going to be mowing every week or something like that, but near the end of the season, you want to start using this. And any machine that you think might sit for more than 6 weeks without being used, like a chainsaw or a pressure washer or a tiller or a snow blower, or even a chainsaw, I think I said, tiller, the sort of machines that don't get regular use, you want the fuel inside the gas tank to be full and with stabilizer. Now, that's the most effective and easy method that I know of. There are 2 other methods which I'll mention, but I would say for most of you, this is going to be the best bet, and it's not expensive, and this amount treats up to 40 gallons, so that's going to last you several years. The second option is to make sure that your engines start and run every 4 weeks, and they call this exercising your equipment. Basically, every 4 weeks, you need to start up the machine and let it idle for 5 minutes, and then add fuel back to the fuel tank if the fuel has dropped. And that ensures that you're always cycling through fresh fuel. It also keeps any bits and pieces that would build up flushed into the engine, and you're always getting fresh fuel from the fuel tank into the carburetor. That's pretty much what I do, but I always have my hands on engines, and so it works for me. The third option, and this is for, I would say, the minority, is to store your machines dry without fuel. And the reason I don't recommend that is because it's very hard to get a machine completely dry. So that means the fuel tank has to be dry, the fuel line has to be dry, and all of the fuel has to be out of the carburetor. So you can remove the bowl from a carburetor, or you can remove the drain plug, but you really need to let it sit for several hours or several days, better yet, in the sun, and make sure that everything is out, totally dry. Because if you have even just a little bit of the carburetor, it'll go bad. And I owned a generator at one time, and I tried to store it dry, and I failed to get all of the fuel out of the fuel line, and it went bad. And so when I needed it, I had to basically rebuild the carburetor. So I would not recommend, I do recommend storing your machines dry, but it's very difficult to make sure they're totally dry. And so I would only do that if you're really confident that you can get it there. So the next thing I want to mention, this is from Morgan, but for anyone else who doesn't know, so basically any machine like a chainsaw or the vast majority of blowers and string trimmers are what are called 2-stroke or 2-cycle. And that means that there's not a big amount of oil sitting somewhere in the engine like you have on your car. And that means that you have to mix oil in with the gasoline. And that's typically, it's a certain type of oil. It's not just any type of oil. It's called 2-stroke oil or 2-cycle oil, or sometimes it's called mix oil. And the way that I recommend buying it is in one of these special containers where you squeeze the bottom and you fill up this container to the different markings that they have, and then you pour it out and add it on. They do make little bottles that you can buy, and that's fine. There's 2 things I don't like about those bottles. In general, it's more expensive than buying it this way because you're only buying this container once, and you're buying that container repeatedly. The other thing is that quantity of oil is dedicated to a gallon of fuel. And so if you have, let's say, half a gallon of fuel or 5 gallons of fuel, those containers sort of aren't that compatible without doing some math and figuring it out. What I like to do is buy a container like this one time, and then in the future just buy a big half-gallon or quart or gallon of 2-cycle oil and just refill this thing. So you basically just buy this special container one time, and then you can start buying in bulk and save a little bit more money. You can of course buy from Ace Hardware, Home Depot, or whatever, these like 1-quart bottles of already mixed 2-cycle 2-stroke gasoline. And basically all that is they went to the store and they bought some gasoline, and then they pre-mixed it with 2-cycle oil for you, and then they put it in a can and they sold it to you. And that is fine, but it is, over the long haul, extremely expensive, far more expensive than just getting fuel from the gas station and adding your own. Yeah, you're just paying a lot of money for it. Now, normally it has stabilizer built in, so it'll also last you through the winter and things like that. So what some people do as a strategy is they use regular gas from the gas station throughout the season, and then they'll store their machines with that pre-bought gasoline. And that's a fine approach. It's just a lot more expensive. If you actually look at the price per gallon on that pre-bought stuff from Ace Hardware, like from Steel, Moto Mix, it's just extremely expensive. And I don't think it's worth it for 99% of people. So what you need in the end is 2 gas cans, the big one for your pressure washer and your lawnmower and your generator, things like that are 4-stroke and don't require oil, and then a smaller can for your weed whacker and all of that stuff that takes 2-stroke. and then you just want to make sure that you're adding the 2-stroke oil here. Normally what I do is I'll take this to the gas station empty, I'll pump exactly 1 gallon in it, and that way I know exactly how much to add. But most of them also have a line on them so that if you take from a larger one and put in here, you can just fill it up to the mark and then add the corresponding amount of oil. So yeah, I think that covers it for you, Morgan, and for anybody else. That is the most cost-effective way to fuel your machines, and that it ensures that you won't have any failures in general, of course, and then you won't have problems after your season kicks back up and you go to start your mower or whatever for the very first time. Last thing I'll mention is the difference between the different octane ratings. So what happens is, now this is a little technical, but I'll say it anyway. When the piston in the engine begins to compress the air in the fuel, if the fuel is too low of an octane, it will self-ignite before the spark plug fires. We call that pre-ignition or detonation. There's a couple different terms for it. There's some technical differences, but you don't want that. And so the octane that you need for your machine is listed on the machine or listed on your car. And that's because the manufacturer knows the compression ratio as the piston goes up into the compression stroke. If your engine calls for 87 octane, there is no benefit to running 93, none. So don't think of 93 octane fuel as being better than 85 octane fuel. Think of it as only better if you have an engine that requires it. And so you should not be buying premium fuel unless your engine calls for it. And in the vast, vast, vast majority of cases, all you need is 87 octane. That's all I've ever run on my machines or anyone else's machines. They run perfectly fine, and there's no point in buying better fuel. I also would not recommend buying pure fuel. So if you go to a gas station, sometimes for about an extra $1 a gallon, you can buy 100% gasoline that has no ethanol in it. I don't recommend it simply because of the cost. I've run 87 with ethanol for the last 10 years. I've fixed 500 customers' machines who are basically running the same thing. You don't need to spend that extra money. Does the ethanol in the fuel affect the storage performance? Probably a little bit, but even if you buy 100% fuel, it's still gonna go bad within 3 or 6 months, whether or not you have the ethanol. And so if you wanna spend your spending money on your gasoline and you wanna put an extra $1 per gallon into your weed whacker, go ahead. It's not gonna hurt anything, but I really don't think it's necessary. And if you're doing it to then avoid the use of stabilizer, or if you're doing it so that you can store the vehicle or whatever for a year, that's not the right solution for that problem. So, all right, I hope that was helpful for you, Morgan. Call me anytime, as you know that. But for the rest of you, I hope that was helpful. If not, let me know by giving me a thumbs down. And go buy Steel Moto Mix for all of your stuff, and buy 100% pure fuel for all of your other stuff, and you'll never have a problem. All right, folks, take care.